Picture this, a 95-year-old former intelligence operative firing an RPG in the middle of her Texas farm to stop a heavily armed cartel convoy. This astonishing moment where Harriet West took aim and single-handedly turned the tide of battle is just one of the incredible twists in our story. If that scene already has you on the edge of your seat, trust me, you'll want to hear everything that led up to it and everything that follows. In this continuing saga, secret underground facilities, bold last stands, and uneasy alliances intertwine, showing us that courage and determination can come from the most unexpected places. Each character, from the steadfast sheriff to the mysterious federal agents, plays a vital role in the fate of Rio Lindo. Before we go any further, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, support the channel, stay informed of new stories, and help us keep bringing you epic tales like this one. Hattie West had long been a fixture in the border community of Rio Lindo, Texas. At 95, she was presumed by most to be only a quiet old farmer, tending her land a few miles from the Mexican border. She was known for her gentle eyes, silver hair pinned into a neat bun, and a deliberate way of moving that suggested wisdom in every step. Her small wooden farmhouse, built decades ago, stood on land that her late husband, Arthur, had once tended with equal devotion. Nestled behind wind-worn fences and fields of sorghum, the house looked much like any other old homestead in the region. But beneath its peeling paint and gently sagging roof, there were secrets older than anyone in Rio Lindo might have guessed. One sweltering summer morning, as the sun soared over the parched fields and the faint hum of cicadas filled the air, Harriet set out to check the perimeter of her property. Although her body moved slowly, her mind remained sharp. She'd learned from a lifetime of caution to notice the subtlest disruptions in routine. An unusual set of footprints in the soil, a recently cut fence wire, or unfamiliar tire tracks on the dusty road. That morning, she found such tracks near the eastern edge of her farmland. They were deep and fresh, left by vehicles heavier than the local pickups. She paused, leaning on her weathered cane, and scanned the horizon with a practiced eye that had once guided her through missions in World War II. Rio Lindo itself seemed quiet. Too quiet, some might have said. The main street boasted a single diner, Lucia's, which was the heart of the community, a small general store, a single-pump gas station, and a modest church. Fewer than 2,000 people lived in this dusty border town, and while many believed they knew everything there was to know about one another, Harriet West was a living testament to how carefully kept secrets could be hidden right under their noses. She had been, after all, part of one of America's most clandestine intelligence circles many decades prior. She had served with distinction in a multitude of missions that never made the headlines, forging alliances with people as far-flung as Europe and Asia. Yet to her neighbors, she was simply Miss Hattie, the kindly elder who waved from her porch. That afternoon, Harriet drove her rusty old truck into the heart of Rio Lindo. The vehicle had a cracked windshield and a faded blue paint job, but it still roared to life every time. She arrived first at the gas station, where a tall, lanky teenager named Thomas hurried to greet her. His usual grin was subdued as he filled her tank. The boy's eyes darted around as if searching for invisible threats. Harriet noticed immediately. He confessed that men in black SUVs had stopped by, asking pointed questions about available properties, particularly hers. A slight chill ran through Harriet's veins, but her face betrayed nothing. She merely thanked Tomas, paid for her gas, and continued on her route. Not long after, she stopped at Lucia's diner for her customary afternoon coffee. At a corner booth, she saw two men in sharp suits and boots that had a threatening edge. Their gazes trailed her every move. Lucia, the diner's 50-something proprietress, looked visibly shaken, her hands trembling around the coffee pot. Harriet calmly took a seat at the counter, struck up a brief conversation about the weather, and gleaned enough from Lucia's uneasy chatter to confirm that strangers had arrived. Unpleasant strangers. Harriet knew precisely what sort of men they were. Members of a cartel, and from the whispers around town, they belonged to Los Venenos, a dangerous syndicate run by a man called Victor El Fuego Reyes, reputed for his brutality and cunning. As Harriet left the diner that day, the two strangers' eyes flickered with cold intent. She wondered how boldly they might move if pressed. She could almost feel the tension crackling behind her, an unspoken threat in the thick, humid air. Her old truck rattled back down the main street, passing the church where Father Connolly was sweeping the front steps. Even the priest seemed more watchful than usual, pausing to peer at the suspicious cars parked in unusual spots. Harriet returned to her farmhouse, certain of one thing. The peace that Rio Lindo had known for decades was about to shatter. That evening, she sat in her small living room and studied the set of 3 locked safes behind an old portrait of Arthur. One safe contained more conventional valuables, like birth certificates, old family heirlooms, and a few pieces of fine jewelry. Another held old journals and scattered keepsakes from her intelligence days. But it was the final, larger safe that held the real tools of Harriet's old trade, specialized communication devices that operated on secure frequencies. She had guarded them meticulously for years, never suspecting she might actually need to use them again, until now. As Harriet methodically tapped in the safe combination, a series of numbers no one but she and Arthur had ever known, her mind flashed back to a dim memory of a mission in northern France, nearly 80 years prior. The silent tension, the cryptic code words, the necessity of stealth. It all felt far away now. But beneath her warm, grandmotherly exterior lay the same sharp intellect and unflinching resolve that had guided her in those covert days. She understood cartels too well. They thrived on intimidation, and they believed in controlling territory through fear. Los Venenos had undoubtedly decided her land would serve as a prime location for something illicit, perhaps a staging area for smuggling routes. They expected an elderly woman to surrender. They had no idea who Harriet West truly was. She removed one of the special phones, a black boxy device that looked ancient by modern standards, and powered it on. It took a moment to connect to the secure satellite channel. Once it did, Harriet carefully input a code, her old operative identifier, HW47, followed by a short phrase that signaled a call to arms for anyone in her network who might still be listening. The network was a relic of a time when intelligence officers formed alliances that transcended official boundaries. A ring in Berlin, a contact in Rome, a friend in Hong Kong. Some were probably gone, but Harriet believed enough might remain to recall the debt they owed her. She made 3 calls that night. Each one reconnected her to individuals she hadn't spoken to in decades. She offered few details, only that a threat had come to her doorstep and she needed help to protect her land, her town, and perhaps more than that. After each call, Harriet felt the old, familiar rush of adrenaline. Then, as she closed the final call, she heard the chirp of confirmation. Reinforcements were on their way. Word spread quickly among Rio Lindo's small population that Harriet West had refused to sell her farm. The next morning, heavy-tinted SUVs circled the area around her property as if searching for vulnerabilities. Their occupants, heavily armed men with sharp eyes and cold demeanors, made no attempt to hide their presence. Rio Lindo's sheriff, Stephen Garcia, had only a handful of deputies at his disposal and far too few resources to confront a well-funded criminal organization. Even so, he showed up at Harriet's gate before sunrise to warn her. "Miss Hattie," he said, removing his hat respectfully, "I'm sure you've seen these men hanging around. They're bad news. If you need anything, anything at all, you let me know." His worry was etched into the lines of his face, but Harriet merely smiled and offered him a cup of coffee on her porch. Over the steam of that strong brew, she thanked him, acknowledging that times might get rough. Sheriff Garcia had a moral compass that compelled him to protect his town. Harriet could see the frustration in his eyes. Los Venenos were more than a group of street thugs. They had a sophisticated hierarchy, extensive funding, and connections that stretched across the border. One deputy had whispered that their leader, Victor El Fuego Reyes, had personally overseen expansions into multiple border towns. Yet Harriet offered no sign of intimidation. She remained calm, a small grin tugging at the corner of her mouth, as if anticipating a confrontation she'd been training for her entire life. After Garcia left, Harriet walked along her fence line, recalling missions from decades past. She had been a shadowy presence in operations spanning continents. She understood that a direct attack on her farm would come, and that the cartel might escalate quickly once they realized intimidation wouldn't work. In the small storage shed near her barn, she took stock of what she had: old flares, radio scanning devices, a half-dozen battered rifles that Arthur had maintained. Everything else, anything more advanced, would have to come from her allies, assuming they arrived in time. By mid-afternoon, Harriet spotted a glint on the main road, the silver Mercedes of a woman who looked both out of place and entirely self-possessed. It was Felicia Novak, a former intelligence analyst Harriet had once saved from a precarious assignment in Eastern Europe. Felicia was at least 20 years Harriet's junior, but carried the same unwavering stance of a seasoned operative. She stepped out, dusting off her immaculate trousers. "Hattie," she said, a note of affection in her voice. "I always said I'd come if you called." Harriet merely gestured for her to come inside. The two sat at the kitchen table, which was already spread with maps of Rio Lindo and the surrounding border territory. Felicia's keen eyes flicked from one mark to another. Harriet had neatly highlighted known cartel presence, choke points, and vantage positions. The two spoke little at first, letting the map tell the story of a small Texas town under looming threat from a fearsome criminal empire. That same evening, a second car arrived, a weathered SUV bearing a man in his early 70s named Franklin Frank Cho, whose life Harriet had once saved in North Africa. He carried himself like a retiree on a leisurely drive, but Harriet knew better. Beneath that amiable exterior was a fiercely capable operations specialist who had run clandestine missions across several continents. Frank embraced Harriet with a hearty laugh. "I'd never forgive myself if I didn't show up," he said, stepping into her kitchen and placing a large, nondescript duffel on the floor. Harriet recognized the shape of weapon cases and specialized gear inside. Felicia was already busy connecting her laptop to the scanning equipment Harriet had stored away. "We intercepted chatter from the cartel's radio frequencies," she explained. "Victor Reyes's men are operating with surprising sophistication. They've bribed local officials in other towns to shut down roads, sabotage businesses, and spread fear." Harriet nodded, her eyes drifting to the old photograph of Arthur on the mantel. "I've seen it before," she said softly. "Fear is always their biggest weapon. Our job is to make sure it doesn't work here." By dawn, more arrivals trickled in, former CIA field officers, a couple of ex-FBI analysts, and even a retired colonel from Special Forces. Each had a debt to Harriet West, or simply a deep respect for her storied reputation. Many had not worked together before, but all trusted Harriet's leadership implicitly. They recognized that she was no ordinary farm widow. She was the quiet architect who had once orchestrated some of the most intricate intelligence operations of the mid-20th century. Together, they created a makeshift command center in Harriet's living room. Computers hummed, old spools of cable stretched across the floor, and a large map of Rio Lindo and the border region covered an entire wall. They tapped into local infrastructure, quietly installing discrete cameras at vantage points around town. Lucia, from the diner, gave them permission to place a hidden camera above her front door, promising that she'd pour coffee as if nothing's amiss. Sheriff Garcia, initially stunned by the sudden influx of Harriet's family friends, offered cautious assistance. Though he couldn't officially sanction any paramilitary action, he was grateful for any help. He stationed his deputies at strategic street corners, hoping that uniformed presence might deter blatant cartel aggression. At the same time, Harriet and Felicia quietly prepped a secure digital channel so Garcia's team could share real-time updates with Harriet's group without raising suspicion. Meanwhile, Victor El Fuego Reyes's men were already making their presence felt. Lucia's diner received a friendly visit from men demanding that local businesses refuse service to Harriet West or face serious consequences. The general store found its deliveries mysteriously canceled. Roadblocks appeared on the outskirts of town, with black SUV after black SUV prowling the dusty streets. Rio Lindo had never seen such an influx of menacing strangers, and tensions settled over the tight-knit community like a thick fog. 3 nights after Harriet's covert calls for help, Los Venenos escalated their tactics. Around midnight, while Harriet and her team monitored the town from her living room, movement appeared on the remote cameras. Several SUVs, with headlights off, inched toward the West Farm. They parked near the fence line, men pouring out with gasoline cans and improvised incendiary devices. It was a typical fear strike. Burn down a key property, intimidate the owner, and display the cartel's power. Harriet, seated near the main window, calmly surveyed the incoming feed on Felicia's laptop. "They're moving in exactly as we expected," she murmured, voice firm. Frank, is your team in position? Frank's answer came through a secure earpiece. We're ready, Nietzsche affirmed. He and three others had set themselves up in the barn's loft. Through night vision scopes, they could see every intruder approach, even as the men tried to remain hidden in the darkness. In a matter of seconds, Harriet's entire yard erupted in stark, blinding light. Floodlights mounted on the barn, and tall poles near the house illuminated the trespassers completely. The men froze, momentarily disoriented by the sudden brightness. Then, Harriet's amplified voice boomed over a loudspeaker installed that afternoon. Gentlemen, she said, her tone tinged with the gentle steel of someone who had stared down fascist soldiers decades ago, you are trespassing on private property. One of the men, presumably in charge, shouted obscenities. He fired a shot into the air. Yet Harriet's side did not return fire. Instead, Frank's men aimed lasers at the group, small red dots blossoming on chests and foreheads, a silent threat that there were angles and vantage points the intruders couldn't possibly see. You can walk away, Harriet continued, voice even, or you can stay and explain to your boss why you never came back. The cartel leader sneered, cursing as he scanned the darkness to locate Harriet's defenders. But the sight of so many laser sights gave him pause. After a tense moment, he signaled his men to retreat. The SUVs disappeared into the night, leaving only dust and tire tracks behind. Harriet exhaled. The first test had come and gone, with Harriet's farm still standing. Yet no one in her living room celebrated. They all understood the significance of the cartel's hasty retreat. Los Venenos would not take this embarrassment lying down. If they couldn't subdue Harriet through a quick show of force, they would escalate in ways far more destructive. Harriet's phone buzzed and Felicia answered to confirm that watchers near the outskirts of Rio Lindo had spotted a larger contingent of cartel vehicles massing, possibly setting up a more permanent presence. It'll only get worse from here, Harriet said, her voice grave. But every move they make tells us more about their operation. We'll be ready. By daybreak, Rio Lindo was abuzz with rumors of the overnight confrontation. Some said Harriet West had hired mercenaries. Others insisted she had government backing. Lucia's diner was filled with talk of bright floodlights and phantom snipers. Each tale more embellished than the last. The only certainty was that Harriet's farm remained untouched. No smoke rose from burned-out barns. No bullet holes scarred the farmhouse. Meanwhile, Harriet's improvised command center analyzed fresh intel. A new wave of cartel operatives had arrived before dawn, checking into the town's only motel. Locals could easily spot them, men in dark jeans wearing the casual uniform of intimidation. Harriet's watchers caught glimpses of them loading crates and meeting quietly with a local real estate agent. Through hidden microphones placed near the motel, Felicia's equipment captured snippets of conversation suggesting that El Fuego himself would soon visit Rio Lindo in person, an ominous sign. Sheriff Garcia stopped by Harriet's again, hat in hand. He confessed that official channels were near useless. Higher-level agencies were slow to respond, citing bureaucratic red tape. I've sent requests for federal support, but it's going to take time, he said, eyes apologetic. And we both know time is what we don't have. Harriet offered him a consoling pat on the shoulder. We'll do what we can, she said simply. She knew that once the cartel started cementing its presence, they would target not just her farm, but the entire town. By strangling the local economy through intimidation of local businesses, forced closures, and control of incoming supplies, Los Venenos would systematically break Rio Lindo's spirit. She also knew how to turn that tactic against them. In that afternoon's briefing, Harriet laid out a plan with Felicia and Frank. They would gather evidence, concrete, undeniable proof of the cartel's human rights abuses, property crimes, and intimidation tactics. The ultimate goal was not only to repel the invaders, but to expose them so thoroughly that larger agencies on both sides of the border could not ignore the revelations. Their plan involved hidden cameras, wiretaps, financial tracking, and a digital data dump that would bring public scrutiny on a scale even El Fuego might fear. They also discussed forging alliances with local residents who had grown wary of the new strangers in town. Lucia and Father Connolly were key players. Both were well-respected and could keep the local community informed. Keeping morale strong would be essential if the cartel tried to use terror tactics such as kidnapping or random violence. Fear, Harriet emphasized, would always be their tool. United resolve must be the town's response. Even as Harriet detailed these strategies, new vehicles arrived outside, a couple of beige vans and old sedans carrying more of her former colleagues. Among them, a retired FBI agent named Douglas Brooks stepped out, along with a pair of ex-Special Forces soldiers. Each wore the expression of someone who had seen crisis before and intended to prevent it from escalating. Harriet welcomed them all in, quickly assigning roles. With every person who joined her cause, Harriet felt her resolve deepen. She recalled the sharp lessons learned over decades of clandestine work. Underestimating your opponent is fatal, but so is underestimating your own capacity to fight back. That night, the cartel unleashed what Harriet had predicted, a flurry of attacks on vulnerable targets around Rio Lindo. Lucia's diner had its windows smashed just after midnight. The general store was lit ablaze in a sudden fire. A local couple who refused to sell their property was assaulted on the deserted main road. Sirens blared as Sheriff Garcia and his deputies raced from one emergency to another, never able to be in more than one place at once. The sight of flickering flames against the Texas night sky cast a pall of dread over the sleepy town. Within Harriet's farmhouse, the phone lines lit up. People were frantic. Some had witnessed masked men moving with military efficiency, leaving behind a path of destruction and fear. Harriet's volunteers, men and women who had arrived quietly over the past days, fanned out, discreetly recording evidence of the crimes. They used night vision cameras, body cams, and specialized equipment to capture every bullet casing, every shattered window, and every face caught on camera. But Harriet had predicted more than just raw violence. She knew that once the cartel's shock and awe phase concluded, they would systematically consolidate power. By dawn, the exact scenario played out. Checkpoints appeared on major intersections, each manned by armed cartel members. Local businesses received visits, urging them to pay for protection. People were threatened to remain silent or face the consequences. Los Venenos acted as though they already owned Rio Lindo, expecting submission. Except they hadn't accounted for Harriet's network. Her watchers kept careful notes on who was stationed where, rotating in shifts so that their presence wasn't easily noticed by the roving SUVs. Lucia, with her diner windows boarded up, continued serving coffee and collecting stray bits of conversation from the men who boasted of controlling the region. Father Connolly opened the church as a refuge. Harriet had stationed 2 retired medics there with supplies, anticipating that injuries would escalate. During these tense hours, Harriet barely slept. She orchestrated from her kitchen table, scanning real-time feeds on Felicia's system. She had pinned a detailed map to the wall, color-coding cartel movements. The older woman's face was grimly focused, and her voice, though calm, carried a sense of urgency. Every hour mattered. Every piece of intelligence gleaned could save lives and set the stage for a counterstrike. Late the following evening, Harriet received word from an unlikely ally, a local rancher named Diego Morales, who had hidden in a hayloft to avoid detection. Diego overheard crucial details about where the cartel stored its latest shipment of arms. Harriet recognized the significance. If they could seize or destroy that stash, they'd cripple a huge part of the cartel's capability. So Harriet quietly dispatched Frank and a small team, who slipped out under cover of darkness and used old desert trails to reach the warehouse. At 2 in the morning, Harriet sat poised at her radio, waiting for Frank's coded signal. Her heart pounded harder than it had in years. The seconds stretched. Finally, the static broke with Frank's short, triumphant message, "Package secured." Harriet smiled. In the face of the cartel's widespread terror, her side had landed a key blow. A blow that, if used wisely, could turn the tide. Morning arrived with a swirl of acrid smoke still hanging over Rio Lindo from the fires that had ravaged the general store and parts of the diner. Yet word quickly spread that something had gone wrong for the cartel overnight. Their main stash of weapons, hidden in a dilapidated old storage facility, had vanished, seized or destroyed by persons unknown. The men guarding that site were found tied up and humiliated but alive, stripped of their radios and sidearms. Despite the success, Harriet cautioned her team against overconfidence. She knew that acts like this would enrage El Fuego. Already rumors circulated that the cartel leader was en route, furious and ready to exact vengeance. Harriet suspected that the removal of the arms shipment combined with the covert intelligence gathering, might provoke him into making a highly public move. A cornered predator was at its most dangerous. Sure enough, by mid-morning, an armored SUV with tinted windows cruised down Rio Lindo's dusty main street. A tall man with slickened back hair and an assured gait stepped out at Lucia's diner, flanked by men with assault rifles. It was Victor Reyes himself. The hum of fear was palpable as people scurried indoors and locked doors. Reyes strolled inside the diner, where Lucia, bravely refusing to cower, wiped the counter and asked if he wanted coffee. He declined with a razor-thin smile, proclaiming he was there to discuss business opportunities. Behind the scenes, Harriet's network observed everything through hidden cameras. They studied Reyes's posture, the number of bodyguards, and the tone of his voice as he spoke. "We're bringing progress," he declared. "Jobs, security, and wealth to places like Rio Lindo." He pitched the same false promises cartels always use to feign legitimacy, simultaneously referencing the recent fires as unfortunate accidents that he could prevent if the townspeople cooperated. Harriet saw the next tactic forming. After violence failed to achieve complete submission, the cartel would offer a twisted brand of protection in exchange for loyalty. She'd witnessed it happen in distant places decades ago, and the blueprint hadn't changed. Her priority was to ensure that the townspeople did not give in, so she quietly orchestrated a series of small but significant acts of resistance. Lucia kept the diner open, Father Connolly refused to yield the church premises, and Harriet's watchers circulated material evidence of cartel brutality to select community members. The idea was to galvanize local resolve. Meanwhile, Harriet had not forgotten about the puzzle that first piqued her curiosity. Why was Los Venenos so set on controlling her particular farm? She and Felicia pored over old county records, cross-referenced geological surveys, and combed through historical documents. Something about her property was especially valuable, and Harriet didn't think it was merely its proximity to the border. When Felicia found a cryptic reference to a secret government project from the early 1960s, Harriet's instincts blazed like a fire. She recognized the hallmark of Cold War subterfuge. If the cartel wanted her land that badly, it implied a hidden agenda beyond mere smuggling routes. Even as they confronted daily threats, thugs at the door, black SUVs prowling at night, the bigger mystery loomed. Harriet had spent years burying certain secrets, some of which even her closest allies didn't fully know. And if the cartel was on the verge of unearthing them, the stakes were about to become far higher than anyone in Rio Lindo could imagine. The following afternoon, Felicia unlocked a series of files on her laptop that Harriet had kept from her intelligence days, records Harriet had personally safeguarded, stored offline all these decades. Within these yellowing files, they discovered references to Project Long Shadow, a clandestine initiative rumored to involve advanced technology or discoveries made at the height of the Cold War. Some older notes suggested that the government identified certain areas near the border as strategic fallback zones in the event of national catastrophe. Harriet's land, according to hush-hush memoranda, had unique geological features that made it paramount for special containment. Felicia traced the property records back 5 decades. There were signifiers of multiple underground structures built in the early 1960s, possibly part of a larger subterranean network. One line in particular stood out: Site 12, sealed in 1962, top priority. Felicia looked at Harriet, eyes questioning. Harriet nodded gravely. "Arthur and I weren't just a simple farming couple after the war. We volunteered for something we believed would protect our country if the worst ever happened." Before Felicia could ask more, an urgent call from Frank came in through the radio. Armed cartel members were setting up barricades near the southwestern road leading out of Rio Lindo. Harriet recognized the location as a potential infiltration point. She quickly dispatched 2 teams to monitor the site and maintain radio contact with the local ranchers. Even as she directed these field operations, Harriet's mind churned over the revelations about her farm. If Los Venenos was even half aware of Project Long Shadow, they might try to excavate whatever was buried beneath that sealed underground structure. By sunset, Harriet's living room was once again crowded with allies. The tension in the air thickened as Felicia briefed everyone on the possible significance of Harriet's property. They concluded that the cartel's abrupt interests could indicate they'd stumbled onto partial intel, enough to know something valuable lay beneath Harriet's farm, but not enough to understand its full import. If so, Rio Lindo was poised on the edge of not just a violent cartel takeover, but a confrontation with secrets that might attract attention from powerful factions on both sides of the border. That night, Harriet walked her farm's perimeter alone, gazing at the silhouettes of twisted mesquite trees in the moonlight. She carried a small flashlight and her cane, recalling how, years ago, she and Arthur had supervised the secret construction of specific reinforced entrances, all concealed by barn walls and camouflage netting. She wondered if the local townspeople could handle the truth about what lay hidden just below their feet, if they'd believe it, or if it would sound like the feverish invention of an old woman longing for the days of espionage. In her pocket, Harriet clutched an old key that once opened a control room beneath the barn. She remembered Arthur's firm words: "If this place is ever compromised, we must seal it for good, no matter the cost." Back then, the specter of nuclear war loomed large, and America had built countless bunkers and experimental labs. But this was something else, a site they were sworn to protect or destroy should it fall into the wrong hands. Harriet sensed that moment might be approaching faster than she'd hoped. As Harriet feared, Los Venenos intensified their operation the very next morning. They tightened their stranglehold on local commerce. Trucks delivering supplies to Rio Lindo were rerouted or hijacked, gasoline shipments vanished, and a wave of forced property sales began, with frightened families selling out cheaply to unknown development firms. Sheriff Garcia's phone lines buzzed nonstop with terrified residents begging for help. But official help remained elusive. State and federal agencies were bogged down in bureaucracy, or perhaps infiltrated by cartel influence. At Lucia's diner, men in clean-cut suits and polished shoes arrived, presenting themselves as legitimate business representatives. They sipped coffee politely while explaining to Lucia that economic revitalization was coming and that selling her diner could set her up for life. Lucia calmly declined, fueling the men's frustration. Harriet, observing from a hidden camera, recognized the pattern. The cartel had switched from direct violence to cunning infiltration. They would buy them the town in the guise of a legitimate corporate takeover and manipulate local laws, pay bribes, and remove opposition with a well-calculated mix of legal pressure and intimidation. Meanwhile, Harriet's team discovered further clues about Project Long Shadow. Using a combination of old radio frequencies and decommissioned intelligence channels, they found references to advanced sensors and containment protocols built under Harriet's land. What was it meant to contain? The documents danced around the specifics, hinting at something more disruptive than nuclear arms or chemical weapons. Harriet's features grew tight, recalling cryptic discussions she'd had with senior officials decades earlier. She had always suspected that Project Long Shadow was about controlling something that defied standard explanation, something that had to be kept silent to avoid global panic. The weight of these secrets pressed on Harriet as she went through the daily routine of coordinating defenders, analyzing enemy movements, and stabilizing the morale of townspeople. She confided in Felicia that she feared a worst-case scenario. If the cartel managed to penetrate the old underground facility, they could unintentionally unleash something far larger and more dangerous than either of them could handle. Unaware of these deeper ramifications, Rio Lindo's citizens began forming small clusters of resistance. Some refused to sell their properties, banding together to protect each other's homes or shops. Father Connolly began hosting nightly prayer meetings that were, in truth, strategy sessions on how to thwart intimidation. Families stashed away valuables, anticipating forced entry by cartel enforcers. Quietly, Harriet's network made sure these groups had access to extra phones so they could alert the farmhouse in an emergency. Still, the daily news was grim. Businesses closed from mounting pressure. The diner served fewer people, those too defiant to be scared off. The general store smoldered with broken windows and roof damage from the previous fire, barely operational. 2 deputies resigned out of fear or bribery, leaving Sheriff Garcia with a skeleton crew. Through it all, Harriet quietly prepared for the flashpoint she knew was coming. Late that afternoon, a coded message arrived on Harriet's old secure line, bearing a U.S. government encryption signature. She closed the door to her study, alone, and listened. A voice she hadn't heard in decades calmly stated that certain agencies had become aware of unusual activities at her property. They were dispatching a survey team, no doubt to see how much Harriet remembered and how close the cartel was to unearthing Project Long Shadow. Harriet's pulse quickened. She recognized the unsubtle threat implied. If the government found the site compromised, they would move to seal it permanently, no matter who stood in the way. That night, Harriet convened a full council of her assembled allies in the farmhouse. Every seat in her living room was taken. Felicia, Frank, Douglas, the retired Special Forces soldiers, and a handful of others with specialized skill sets. Even Sheriff Garcia, exhausted from his station's short-staffed day, joined them, anxious to glean any strategy that might spare his town. A hush fell over the group as Harriet explained the new dimension to the crisis, the possible arrival of a top-secret government task force. They'll claim they're here to protect national security, Harriet stated, her voice steady but tinged with the gravity of one who understood the government's capacity for blunt force. But they'll do whatever it takes to bury the truth, and us with it, if we're not careful. Felicia outlined what they had uncovered about Project Long Shadow, carefully omitting the darkest possibilities to keep morale from collapsing. The subterranean structure, at minimum, contained advanced technology and records from an era of heightened Cold War paranoia. The government had left it sealed, presumably hoping never to use it again. Now the cartels digging around had likely raised alarms in circles powerful enough to act swiftly and ruthlessly. "What do we do?" asked Douglas, arms folded. "We can't fight a war on two fronts, one with the cartel and another with an off-the-books government unit." Harriet's gaze drifted to the map of Rio Lindo pinned to the wall. "We prevent both sides from reaching the heart of the facility," she said firmly. "The cartel wants whatever they think is valuable, and the government wants to ensure nothing leaks. Neither can be allowed to break the seals." A plan began to form. Harriet's farm would be the battleground, but not in the way the cartel or the government expected. They had spent days collecting intel, preparing defenses, and forging alliances in the community. The next step was to lure the cartel into overplaying its hand by mounting a brazen assault. If Harriet's defenders repelled that assault, she could gather overwhelming proof of the cartel's criminal actions, enough to force a large-scale law enforcement response that even corrupted officials couldn't ignore. Simultaneously, they needed to expose certain truths to the government survey team in a controlled manner, so they wouldn't simply swoop in and detonate the entire site. Sheriff Garcia, though stunned at the mention of hidden bunkers and high-stakes secrets, vowed to stand with Harriet. He saw that if the farm fell, the entire town would suffer. And if the government's approach was heavy-handed, innocent people could end up in the crossfire. While they hashed out strategies, Harriet quietly slipped away to the old barn. She unlocked a weather-beaten door in the floor, a hidden trap door that led down into darkness. With a flashlight and careful steps, she descended a flight of concrete stairs that had been disguised for half a century. At the bottom, she found a sealed steel bulkhead, exactly as she and Arthur had last left it. Warning signs from the 1960s, faded but still legible, lined the walls. She tested the lock, satisfied to feel it still held firm. Kneeling, Harriet placed a hand on the cold metal. Memories flooded her. The day she and Arthur stood watch here, the hum of odd machinery behind the walls, the solemn vow they made. Never let this place be used for evil. She closed her eyes, inhaling the musty air. The final confrontation was coming. One way or another, Harriet West would see her vow through, even if it meant sacrificing everything she'd spent her life building. Sunrise arrived with a vengeance, painting the Texas horizon in a blistering glow of orange and red. Harriet West stood on her porch, gaze drifting across the dry expanse of her fields. She did not feel the typical morning calm. A final hush blanketed Rio Lindo, a hush that precedes violent storms. Over the last 2 days, a trickle of alarming signals confirmed her suspicions. More vehicles converging on the outskirts, cryptic radio chatter about preparing the major strike, and rumors that government agents had crossed into town under the guise of geological inspectors. Harriet felt the tension roll through her bones. It was as if two massive storm fronts, one from the criminal underworld, the other from deep within America's classified corridors, were about to collide above her humble farm. Even the air seemed charged, burning hotter than usual. Felicia was the first to join Harriet on the porch. The younger analysts carried a tablet in one hand, scanning the feeds from their hidden cameras around Rio Lindo. We've documented at least 3 new SUVs with tinted windows, Felicia said softly, her eyes flicking to Harriet, and a large truck that looks like it's hauling more gear. The men are wearing the same style boots and carrying themselves like paramilitary. Harriet nodded, lips pressed into a thin line. She recalled how, in her youth, she had orchestrated missions to cut off enemy supply lines precisely at moments like this, in those final hours before battle. This time, though, the enemy encompassed not only Victor Reyes's cartel, but also covert government teams. If even a portion of the intelligence gleaned from the old Cold War documents was accurate, both groups believed Harriet's land concealed something invaluable or unspeakably dangerous. Sheriff Garcia arrived soon after, stepping out of his cruiser with exhaustion etched into every line of his face. 2 nights of minimal sleep and unrelenting calls for help had taken their toll, but the man's resolve held. "Got word from the motel," he told Harriet, removing his wide-brimmed hat. A group of men in suits, likely feds, showed up. They asked about local infrastructure, wanted building plans, water lines, old electrical grids. "They're not hiding their interest in your property, Miss Hattie." Harriet sighed. "They'll try to box us in from every angle," she replied, "but we can't just lock the farm gate and hope they pass beat by." Inside the house, Harriet's makeshift command center buzzed with grim energy. Frank flipping between radio channels, earpiece pressed tight. Ex-Special Forces soldiers, retired intelligence operatives, and a handful of fiercely protective townspeople stood ready for whatever might come. Douglas Brooks, the retired FBI agent, manned the central workstation, feeding every snippet of real-time intel into a digital archive. Meanwhile, Felicia's laptop displayed a swirl of data about energy readings below the farm, evidence that something within the subterranean structure had lain dormant for decades. At precisely 9 in the morning, Harriet's phone rang with a coded signal. She answered, and a crisp voice on the other end said only, "We're close." Then the line went dead. Harriet guessed it was the hush-hush survey team, meaning they might arrive at any moment. The final confrontation was no longer a hazy possibility. It was minutes or hours away. With resolute calm, Harriet turned to her allies. "This is it," she said, her tone free of doubt. "Today we stand, or we lose everything." The first confrontation came from the cartel side, as Harriet had anticipated. Around midday, a convoy of 5 SUVs sped toward the farm, trailing a cloud of dust. Harriet's watchers radioed the alert. Armed men, faces grim with determination, poured out near the property's perimeter. This was no random scare tactic. It was a calculated show of force. From her living room window, Harriet watched as they set up a line of vehicles, engines idling, while several men advanced on foot. Each one carried a rifle. Frank, perched in the barn's loft with binoculars, counted at least 15 hostiles. He signaled Harriet. She stood at the window, calm as stone, with Felicia and 2 others at her side. They had done everything possible to prepare. Sandbags ringed the porch. Makeshift barricades covered the outer doors. Harriet's allies were positioned strategically around the farm, concealed behind thick wooden posts or hidden in haylofts. Yet Harriet's stomach still knotted. She had not wanted to turn her quiet homestead into a fortress, but the cartel had forced her hand. "Miss West," came a shout from beyond the fence. "You and your people step outside, hands up." Harriet peered through a gap in the curtains. A tall figure in a black tactical vest stood out front, brandishing a megaphone. "We know you've taken something from us. This can end peacefully if you hand it over." She knew they referred to the weapons shipment Frank's team had seized. Harriet also knew it was never about that single stash. The cartel needed total submission to ensure no further resistance. She inhaled, remembering all the times she had faced terrifying odds in foreign lands. This would be no different. The only difference now was the place she called home. She glanced at Felicia, who gave a small nod. Then Harriet stepped onto the porch, arms at her sides, posture regal despite her advanced age. It was a hot day, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the farmland. The leader of the cartel group took a step forward, flanked by 2 heavily armed men. "You're trespassing," Harriet said simply, voice carrying through the still air. "Leave now or face the consequences." A humorless grin twisted the leader's mouth. You're in no position to give orders, old lady. Hand over the weapons you stole and surrender any evidence you've gathered. As if in response, the barn's floodlights flicked on, even in midday sun. Their glare was symbolic, an echo of the earlier strategy Harriet's team had used to disorient midnight intruders. The men looked uneasy for a second, scanning the yard. That was enough. In those heartbeats, Harriet could feel her allies aiming their weapons from hidden vantage points. Lasers poised for the perfect shot. Go home, Harriet repeated, unmoving. For a moment, no one spoke. Wind rustled through the dry grass, then a single gunshot cracked the silence, fired by one of the cartel men. Harriet dove sideways, the bullet splintering wood near where she'd stood. In a synchronized blur, Harriet's defenders answered. The farm erupted in gunfire. The crisp pop of rifle shots mingled with the heavy boom of shotguns as Harriet's defenders unleashed a carefully orchestrated response. Within seconds, the cartel squad realized they were outflanked, pinned by fire from the barn loft, the roof of the farmhouse, and well-camouflaged foxholes along the fence line. Dust clouds rose around the SUV convoy as bullets spanged off metal hoods and shattered windshields. Harriet scrambled back through the farmhouse door, heart pounding. She paused behind an overturned oak table, exchanging a nod with Felicia, who sat pressed against the wall, scanning multiple camera feeds. Every vantage they had prepared in advance was paying off. Frank's voice crackled over the radio. They're pulling back. 4 men pinned behind the second SUV, another group falling back to the road. In less than 2 minutes, the cartel men realized they faced a withering crossfire. 2 lay wounded beside the fence, while the rest struggled to return effective fire without being exposed. More shots thundered across the field, and Harriet caught a glimpse of one of her allies, a former Special Forces soldier named Martin, slipping from a hidden trench to reposition behind a tractor. He fired short, disciplined bursts, striking the cartel line with precision. It wasn't a question of raw force. Los Venenos had that in spades. But Harriet's defenders used every tactical advantage, elevation, cover, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. Realizing they had walked into a deadly trap, the surviving cartel men piled into the remaining SUVs. Engines roared as they sped away in a cloud of dust, leaving their wounded comrades behind in the searing sun. For an instant, Harriet thought it was over, at least for the moment. Then came a screech of tires from the road. Another SUV, this one different from the others, swung into view. At first, Harriet braced for a second wave of cartel gunmen. But what spilled out were men in suits, dark ties, earpieces, and an unmistakable government bearing. They rushed forward, brandishing pistols, barking orders that no one could hear over the ringing in their ears. It was chaos. The wounded cartel men writhed on the ground. Harriet's allies tried to maintain defensive positions, and these new arrivals seemed intent on inserting themselves into the standoff. FBI, drop your weapons, came a shout. Harriet doubted it was truly the FBI, given the hush-hush phone calls. More likely it was the rumored survey team, traveling under a cover of official authority. Bullets had stopped flying for the moment, but tension remained razor-sharp. Harriet peered over the table, scanning the yard. Frank held position in the barn loft, uncertain of these newcomers. Felicia watched the camera feeds with alarm, noticing the advanced gear clipped to the men's belts, devices that looked more like detection instruments than standard FBI kit. Between the battered SUVs and a swirl of dust, one of the suited figures caught Harriet's eye. He was tall, with streaks of gray at his temples. The expression on his face was grim, like a soldier on a battlefield he never intended to enter. His gaze raked over the scene, lingering on Harriet, and something in his eyes told her, he knows about Project Long's shadow. Confusion reigned in the aftermath of the shootout. The cartel's hasty withdrawal left 2 of their men bleeding on Harriet's land, and nobody was sure what to do about these alleged federal agents now barking orders for everyone to drop their weapons. Harriet, mustering her resolute calm, signaled to her allies through a subtle hand gesture. Stand down for a moment, it said. Let's see who we're dealing with. Slowly, Harriet stepped off the porch, arms raised halfway to convey she was no threat. Dust and gunpowder tinted the air, burning the inside of her nose. You say you're FBI, she called out, voice carrying over the moans of the wounded. I'd like to see some identification. One of the men in suits, smooth-cheeked with a calculated stance, flashed a badge too quickly to read. "We're a specialized unit," he said curtly. "Domestic counterterrorism." Yet Harriet caught the faint flicker in his expression. He wasn't accustomed to giving details to civilians. Meanwhile, the tall man with gray at his temples stared at Harriet with cool appraisal. He approached, pistol holstered, pulling out a black folder. "Director Hoffman, FBI," he claimed, offering what looked like official credentials. Harriet eyed it. The identification seemed authentic at a glance, but Harriet suspected there was more to him. His next words confirmed it. "We've been alerted to possible contraband on this property. We have intelligence suggesting foreign agents have been operating here with advanced weaponry. We need immediate access to all outbuildings." Harriet suppressed a scoff. She recognized government doublespeak. "I'm Harriet West," she replied, "and you've arrived in the middle of a cartel attack." She gestured to the moaning men by the fence. "Those aren't my people. They came here firing bullets." Director Hoffman's gaze flicked around the yard. "We have a mandate to secure any threat to national security," he said, ignoring her statement about the cartel. "Starting with your barn." From the porch, Felicia stepped forward, speaking calmly. "Director, we have reason to believe the men you see on the ground are affiliated with Los Venenos. They attempted to seize this property by force. We defended ourselves." Two black-clad agents swept toward the barn, ignoring Felicia, but Frank emerged and blocked their path. Harriet's stomach knotted. Another confrontation loomed. "Nobody goes inside," Frank said, voice steady, rifle pointed downward but ready. "This is private property, and you haven't shown a warrant." A charged standoff formed. Harriet's allies, battered but resolute, glared at the newly arrived suits. The men in suits, although fewer in number, held the aura of official power, an intimidation factor Harriet knew well from her years in the intelligence world. Behind them, an unmarked van rumbled into the yard. More black-suited figures hopped out, carrying the metallic cases and peculiar equipment. Harriet's eyes narrowed. These weren't standard-issue FBI items. They looked more like advanced sensors, specialized scanners. It was reminiscent of the documents she'd seen referencing containment protocols. "I don't think they care about these wounded men," Felicia whispered to Harriet discreetly, "or about the cartel at all. They're here for Project Long Shadow." Harriet gave a tight nod. She realized that her fight might no longer be with the cartel alone. The men claiming to be federal agents were about to cross a line in the name of national security. If they reached the hidden door beneath the barn, Harriet feared they'd do something drastic. In the tense moments that followed, Sheriff Garcia arrived on the scene in his cruiser, sirens whooping. He parked beside one of the bullet-riddled SUVs, stepping out with hands raised to show he posed no threat. "What in God's name is happening here?" he demanded, glancing between Harriet's defenders, the wounded cartel men, and the newly arrived feds. Director Hoffman strode toward the sheriff, brandishing that black folder again. "We're with the FBI," he stated. "There's a suspected national security threat on this property." He aimed a curt nod at the barn. "We have to investigate, cooperate, or face obstruction charges." Garcia's shoulders tensed. He eyed Harriet uncertainly. "If you truly are FBI, let's see your warrant," he said, voice steady despite obvious nerves. "Otherwise, I can't just let you do as you please." One of Hoffman's subordinates responded with open disdain. "You're out of your depth, Sheriff. This is classified. We don't need your permission to secure federal interests." Anger flickered across Garcia's face, but Harriet laid a hand on his arm, a silent plea for calm. She had known that confronting the government element might be the hardest part. Felicia whispered in Harriet's ear that they were pulling more crates from the unmarked van, likely instruments to detect subterranean anomalies. Harriet realized they were not bluffing. They had come prepared for whatever they suspected lurked beneath her farmland. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the dirt road. Harriet's heart lurched. Had the cartel come back? She whirled, seeing a second convoy of Los Venenos vehicles cresting a low hill, bristling with men on truck beds. Black flags fluttered in the scorching wind. Evidently, the cartel had regrouped after their earlier defeat and now came with reinforcements. Harriet recognized this was the worst possible timing. Hoffman and his men crouched behind their SUV, pistols drawn. Harriet's defenders took up positions, rifles aimed at the incoming threat. With the government team entrenched in the yard and the Cartel approaching from the road, Harriet's farm was now the crucible for a showdown neither side had planned to share. Tires squealed as the cartel vehicle skidded to a halt. A tall figure jumped out of the lead truck, none other than Victor El Fuego Reyes himself, face contorted with rage. He shouted something in Spanish, ordering his men to advance. They opened fire, bullets chewing up the dusty ground between the barn and the vehicles. Chaos exploded. The supposed FBI agents found themselves targets of cartel gunfire along with Harriet's people. Harriet crouched behind a tractor, cursing under her breath. She could almost hear Arthur's voice. This is a fight we never wanted on our land, but we knew might come. Felicia, pinned by the barn wall, managed to transmit a distress call on one of their secure channels, hoping that other allies in Rio Lindo might intervene. Braving the hail of bullets, Harriet yelled to Hoffman and Garcia, "We have to coordinate, or we'll all be killed." Garcia nodded, ducking behind his cruiser. Hoffman clenched his jaw, scanning the swarm of cartel men advancing. He seemed torn between his hidden mission and the immediate threat. In the end, self-preservation won. He gestured to his subordinates. Together, they formed a makeshift alliance with Harriet's defenders and the overwhelmed sheriff. For the first time, Harriet saw a flash of genuine fear in Director Hoffman's eyes. The cartel was attacking with more ferocity than he had anticipated. Harriet realized this might give her a small advantage. If Hoffman needed Harriet's help to survive, he might be more inclined to negotiate once the dust settled, if they all lived that long. Under the punishing sun, the firefight raged. Dust devils spun through the yard, kicked up by stray bullets and roaring engines. Harriet's defenders knew the layout intimately, which gave them a slight edge, but the cartel's numbers were growing. Another wave of gunmen spilled out of a trailing truck, fanning around to flank the barn. Frank radioed urgent warnings from his perch. "They're pushing east side. I count at least 8, heavily armed." Director Hoffman's team, though clearly not standard FBI, proved they were trained for combat. They moved with military precision, coordinating in short, coded bursts through earpieces. Harriet felt a grim satisfaction. "Yes, you're no typical federal agents," she thought. "And now you see what we've been up against." Amid the cacophony, Harriet spotted Victor Reyes behind the shelter of a half-burned mesquite tree. He barked orders, gesturing wildly, his gold watch gleaming in the sun. She felt a flare of anger. This was the man who had terrorized her community, tried to claim her land, and inflicted so much fear. Harriet steadied her rifle on the tractor's edge, but Reyes ducked out of sight. "Not yet," she muttered under her breath. 2 cartel trucks tore around the side of the farm, attempting to breach a weak point in the fence line. But Harriet's team had fortified it with an old combine harvester as a barricade, forcing the vehicles to swerve. That moment of hesitation cost them. Gunfire from Martin and Douglas rained down, disabling one truck, sending the other careening into a ditch. Harriet glimpsed men crawling from the wreckage, scattering. By now, the yard was a confusion of crossfire. Harriet's allies, the pseudo-FBI agents, and the sheriff's meager force on one side, and the seething cartel on the other. While the defenders were outnumbered, their knowledge of the terrain and Harriet's meticulous preparations evened the odds. What had been a serene homestead had transformed into a battlefield. Taking advantage of a brief lull, Director Hoffman darted to Harriet's position behind the tractor. Gunfire crackled to their left, where Felicia and Garcia were returning fire from behind the farmhouse steps. Hoffman's voice was taut. "We can't hold out much longer like this. We need to take out their leader or force them to retreat." Harriet's eyes narrowed. She knew what Hoffman really wanted, not just a military victory, but also an opportunity to pursue his own agenda. "This land is mine," she replied, "and I know every hiding spot from here to the next ranch. If you want to push them back, follow my lead. But I won't let you run straight to my barn and do whatever it is you intend." Hoffman grimaced. Bullets whined overhead, forcing them both to duck. "We don't have time for politics." Harriet's jaw tightened. "This entire showdown is politics. Your secrets, their greed. My only priority is keeping the town and this farm safe." Another burst of gunfire forced them apart. Harriet scrabbled behind the tractor's rear tire, glimpsing a cluster of cartel men advancing rapidly. She raised her rifle, heart hammering, and squeezed off 3 shots. One man dropped. The others dove for cover. Harriet felt no triumph, only the cold resolve of a woman defending her home. Amid the chaos, she understood that if they didn't break the cartel's momentum soon, the conflict would consume them all. She needed to rally her defenders for one decisive push, or else see her beloved land overrun by bullets in secrets she had worked a lifetime to protect. A scattered cry came over Harriet's radio. "They've hit the farmhouse door." One of her defenders reported that a team of cartel gunmen, creeping low through the far side of the yard, had managed to set charges against the main entrance. Harriet's heart slammed in her chest. The files, the maps, the communications gear, all inside. Plus, a hidden corridor leading to the underground bunker. If that corridor was discovered or breached, everything Harriet and Arthur had concealed for decades would be laid bare. Acting on instinct, Harriet barked orders to Felicia and Martin, instructing them to shift positions and reinforce the farmhouse. She also signaled Director Hoffman's men, still behind an SUV, to lay down covering fire. For a moment, Harriet worried they'd refuse. But with bullets flying and the possibility of being flanked by cartel enforcers, the suits complied. They sprayed suppressive fire across the yard, forcing the attackers near the porch to duck. Bolting from behind the tractor, Harriet dashed low across open ground, each footstep kicking dust into the scorching air. She slid behind a water trough, bullets pinging off its metal sides. Ahead, the farmhouse porch was a war zone. She spotted 2 cartel men crouched near the steps, preparing to rush inside. In a moment of terrifying clarity, Harriet raised her rifle. With 2 shots, she dropped them. Nearby, Felicia dove behind a rosebush planter, returning fire with a compact submachine gun. Martin tackled a 3rd intruder, wrestling the man's weapon away. They subdued him with swift force, leaving him dazed on the porch. The makeshift charges the cartel had placed fizzled, producing only minor blasts that scorched a portion of the door but failed to breach. Harriet allowed herself a fleeting breath of relief. Yet the noise from the barn's far side intensified. The pummeling of gunfire mingled with harsh shouts. On her earpiece, Harriet heard Frank exclaim, "They're bringing heavier firepower. Looks like a machine gun in the bed of that truck." Harriet's mind raced. If the cartel pinned them down with superior fire, no one would be able to maneuver. A desperate idea formed. She toggled her radio to the sheriff's channel. "Garcia, you still out there?" she barked. "I'm pinned by the barn gate," Garcia's voice crackled back. "What do you need?" "Get me one of the art baum," Harriet said, heart pounding at the memory of the old contraband stashed in a secure shed. Years ago, an ex-Special Forces friend had left behind a rocket-propelled grenade launcher as a last resort measure. Harriet had never thought she'd see it used on American soil, but these were dire circumstances. "RPG? My God, Harriet, that's necessary," Harriet interrupted. "They have a machine gun in that truck. Bring it here fast." While Harriet hated the thought of escalating to such extreme weaponry, the alternative was allowing the cartel to mow them down. She spotted Director Hoffman to her left, exchanging fire with 2 men behind a felled water tank. Even from a distance, Harriet sensed the tension. They were locked in a savage fight. Maybe after this was over, the government team would turn on her. But for now, they were reluctant allies, united by survival. Another hail of bullets shredded the side of the farmhouse, sending splinters into the air. Harriet grit her teeth. She could only hope Garcia would deliver the RPG in time to tip the balance. A thunderous barrage pounded the yard, each burst of machine gun fire shaking the very foundation of Harriet's property. Dust clouds rolled over the fence, and the relentless rattling made it nearly impossible to think. Harriet crouched behind a toppled feed trough, hearing the metallic clang of bullets striking the heavy metal. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and each breath felt scorching hot. Suddenly she heard a shout and, glancing up, saw Sheriff Garcia sprinting across the yard, cradling an RPG tube in his arms. He ducked low behind the same trough, nearly colliding with Harriet. His face was ashen, adrenaline spiking through his veins. "You really want to fire this here?" he gasped. "We could blow half the farm." "It's loaded with a shaped charge warhead." Harriet answered quickly, recalling the specifics from memory. Aim for that truck bed. If we don't, they'll tear us apart. Garcia nodded, swallowing hard. He set the RPG on the ground, fiddling with the sights. Neither he nor Harriet was an expert with heavy ordnance, but Harriet had at least trained with something similar decades ago. She took a steadying breath, tried to recall the procedure. Meanwhile, the machine gun barked again, bullets piercing the water trough so fiercely that tiny rivulets began leaking from within, forming muddy pools on the ground. Frank's voice cut in over the radio. "We can't hold them much longer. They're about to flank the barn on the north side." Harriet understood the precariousness. She and Garcia had one shot, literally, to neutralize the biggest threat. She hefted the RPG onto her shoulder, guided by Garcia's shaky instructions. "God help us," the sheriff muttered, pressing a hand to Harriet's back for balance. Harriet braced herself against the trough. She peeked over the edge, heart hammering as she spotted the pickup truck with the mounted machine gun. Two cartel men crouched beside it, feeding belts of ammunition. The muzzle flashed as they sprayed another volley toward the barn. Steady now, Harriet told herself. She aligned the sights, the weight of the launcher straining her arms. A swirl of dust and smoke made visibility rough. She exhaled, recalling old training. Squeeze, don't jerk. With a final breath, she fired. A backblast of hot air slammed against Harriet and Garcia, knocking them backward into the trough. The rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the yard in a blur of fire. Harriet barely had time to track it before a deafening explosion erupted. The force knocked cartel gunmen to the ground, and the truck disappeared in a giant plume of smoke, metal fragments spinning skyward. A thunderous roar resonated in Harriet's ears, momentarily drowning all other sounds. When the dust cleared, the machine gun was gone, reduced to twisted scrap. The blast had ignited ammunition in the truck bed, sending flames licking the chassis. A handful of cartel men stumbled away, disoriented. Others lay still. Harriet forced herself to stand on quivering legs, mind reeling from the recoil, her ears ringing. But the effect was immediate. The cartel's main source of suppression fire had been obliterated. Across the yard, Harriet's defenders seized the moment. They surged forward, laying down targeted shots. Director Hoffman's team advanced as well, apparently deciding that Harriet's success with the RPG was reason enough to unify. Gunfire rattled for another minute, then began to taper off as the remaining cartel fighters realized they were outgunned, outmaneuvered. Engines revved, and the battered remnants of Los Venenos' force retreated once again down the dusty road. Harriet's shoulders sagged with exhausted relief, yet she knew better than to celebrate. Reyes might have fled, but he was still alive, and the so-called FBI team kneeling in the smoldering yard had yet to reveal their next move. A grim silence settled over the battlefield as the last of the cartel trucks vanished into the haze. Harriet surveyed the wreckage, bullet-riddled fences, shattered windows in the farmhouse, and the smoking ruin of the cartel's machine gun truck. Bodies and wounded men lay scattered, some moaning in pain. A few of Harriet's defenders nursed minor injuries, scrapes, a bullet graze here, a bruise there. But miraculously, no one on her side was killed in the melee. Director Hoffman and his black-suited subordinates regrouped near their SUV, conferring in hushed tones. Harriet studied them, her rifle resting against her hip. By now, it was blatantly clear they belonged to some secretive government branch tasked with investigating the hidden structure beneath her land. The question was what they intended to do now that the cartel had retreated, at least temporarily. Sheriff Garcia and Felicia took charge of the wounded, both the cartel's and Harriet's. Garcia radioed for ambulances, though it was unclear if local emergency services would dare approach so soon. Felicia, her face streaked with dust, organized Harriet's allies to secure the perimeter and collect spent shells and firearms. Evidence would be crucial if higher authorities showed up asking for answers. Eventually, Director Hoffman approached Harriet. His once pristine suit was torn at the sleeve, and a faint cut above his eyebrows stained the side of his face with dried blood. He didn't look victorious, he looked cornered. "You've got a fine group of fighters," he remarked, voice hoarse. "No ordinary civilians could hold off a cartel assault like that." Harriet wiped sweat from her brow, letting a wry smile flicker. "We're not ordinary, Director, and neither are you." She gestured at the specialized gear still strewn across the ground, scanning devices, sealed crates. Care to drop the facade and tell me why you're really here? He stared back, then exhaled. We've known for some time there was a sealed Cold War facility on this property, a site codenamed Project Long Shadow. My directive is to ensure it remains secure. Our intelligence suggested the cartel caught wind of it too. His jaw tensed. We can't afford for them, or anyone else, to breach what's inside. Harriet felt the old fear coil in her gut. She remembered Arthur's quiet insistence that the place was more dangerous than typical bunkers, that it contained things best left buried. She had never fully understood the science behind it, only that it had the power to cause untold devastation if misused. It's my land, she said firmly, and for 50 years I've protected that secret without your help. Hoffman grimaced. We appreciate that, but times change. If the cartel keeps pushing, they could break through those old walls or stir up forces beyond anyone's control. He gestured at the battered farm, the bullet holes, the reek of gunpowder lingering. You see what they're willing to do just to claim territory. Imagine if they had the slightest inkling of the real power beneath us. Harriet pursed her lips. What's your plan then? He met her gaze. We seal it permanently, no half measures. That might mean demolishing the entire site, farmland included. Felicia, overhearing, shot Harriet a horrified look. Harriet's mouth went dry. If the government decided on total demolition, it might also wipe out everything Harriet cherished about her home, her memories of Arthur, the legacy of her life's work, and the entire town's livelihood. Yet Harriet knew deep down the alternative could be worse, letting El Fuego harness technology or secrets that shouldn't exist in any modern era. She raised her chin, squared her shoulders, and said, we have to find another way. The sun dipped low, casting elongated shadows across what remained of Harriet's pristine farmland. In the distance, columns of dark smoke still rose where a cartel truck had exploded hours earlier. Harriet stood on the front porch, her face grim as she listened to the worried chatter of townspeople who'd ventured from hiding to witness the aftermath. Children clung to their parents, wide-eyed at the bullet holes scarring the fences and the battered porch. Inside the farmhouse, Director Hoffman and his team unpacked advanced scanning devices, hooking them into small generators. Felicia stood nearby, arms folded, watching warily. Every so often, she caught Harriet's eye through the window, an unspoken question about how far they should let these men go. Sheriff Garcia, exhausted, oversaw the loading of the injured cartel members into what few ambulances dared drive this far. Each moment, Harriet expected more vehicles to appear, either with the cartel's vengeance or with additional federal backup. During a tense lull, Harriet slipped away to the barn. The secret trapdoor in the floor beckoned, that ancient steel bulkhead below. She ran her hand along the barn's old wooden beams, remembering how she and Arthur had personally nailed each board. She remembered the hush of nighttime discussions, where top-level officials in dark suits had visited decades ago, marking spots on a blueprint Harriet could scarcely comprehend. She found Frank at the barn's rear, tending a minor gunshot wound on his arm. He winced as she approached. Nothing serious, he insisted, despite the blood staining his sleeve. You doing okay? Harriet managed a weary nod. We're alive, but we're not done. Her gaze traveled to the dusty corner that housed the concealed entrance. She whispered, Project Long Shadow. We can't let the government demolish it blindly. There might be more danger in triggering fail-safes or tampering with whatever's in there. Frank looked uneasy. Then what's the plan? Need to confirm what exactly is down there, Harriet said, and if necessary, destroy it on our terms, not the cartel's or the government's. Her voice quavered slightly. She hated the idea of losing the farmland Arthur had loved, but recognized the potential threat. Before Frank could reply, Felicia entered the barn, scanning for eavesdroppers. Harriet, she said in a hushed tone, they've finished calibrating their sensors. Hoffman's men plan to do an initial sweep any minute. He's already told Garcia to keep your people out of the barn. Harriet clenched her fist. I won't let them stomp around unsupervised. She paused, considering. We might use the fact that they need us. We know every inch of this property. If we negotiate carefully, we can guide how they proceed and keep them from simply setting charges to blow it all to kingdom come. Felicia nodded, but her face remained anxious. We also have to assume the cartel might attack again. Reyes doesn't seem like the type to slink away after a defeat. A deep weariness swept over Harriet, but she tapped her cane on the barn floor, mustering courage. Time is short. Let's bring Hoffman inside the barn and present him with an option. Either we go down there together under strict conditions, or we fight a two-front war with no winners. She exchanged a knowing look with Frank and Felicia. Each bore the same exhausted resolve. Harriet gave the hidden bulkhead one final glance. She remembered the vow she had made decades ago, to protect the world from what lay beneath, to keep knowledge of it from falling into the wrong hands, and to preserve her community from the ravages of unseen threats. Whether that vow would hold now depended on a fragile alliance between Harriet's defenders, a shadowy government force, and a town that refused to surrender to fear. As she stepped out into the waning sunlight, Harriet saw Director Hoffman waiting, arms crossed, near the barn door. His expression suggested impatience and the weight of secrets unspoken. Harriet straightened, gripping her cane. "All right, Director," she said. "Let's talk." Looking back on the battles fought and secrets unearthed, it's clear this story is about more than fierce firefights and covert government missions. In the end, it highlights the strength of everyday people standing together against insurmountable odds. Harriet West, quiet farmer, legendary intelligence veteran, proved that age and experience can outwit the darkest threats when combined with loyal allies in a close-knit community. Though the cartel left scars on Rio Lindo, they failed to break its spirit. And while federal agents nearly razed everything to protect their precious secret, Harriet's determination prevailed, forging an unexpected cooperation that saved lives and preserved the town's future. It reminds us that unity, resilience, and compassion can triumph over greed and secrecy. Thank you for sharing this journey. If you enjoyed the tale, please comment with your thoughts and theories. Let's discuss your favorite moments, unexpected twists, or anything else this story inspired. And of course, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories ahead.